How did people get to work on time before alarm clocks? Before the average industrial worker in England had access to alarm clocks, someone needed to wake them up. This fell to the knocker-ups, or knocker-uppers, or simply, knockers, who would go around working-class neighborhoods around Britain with sticks, pea shooters, poles or anything else that would help them knock on doors and windows to get people up. A knocker-upper, or knocker-up, was an honorable, and very vital job in the 19th and early 20th centuries. A knocker-up was a member of a profession in the Netherlands, Britain, Ireland, and some other countries that started during, and lasted well into the Industrial Revolution, when alarm clocks were neither cheap nor reliable. A knocker-up's job was to rouse sleeping people so they could get to work on time. By the 1940s and 1950s, this profession had more or less entirely died out, although it still continued in some pockets of industrial England until the early 1970s. The knocker-up used a baton or short, heavy stick to knock on the client's doors or a long and light stick, often made of bamboo, to reach windows on higher floors. One famous photograph shot in 1931 by John Topham shows a knocker-up in East London using a pea shooter. In return for the task, the knocker-up would be paid a few pence a week. Some knocker-ups would not leave a client's window until they were sure that the client had been awakened, while others simply tapped several times and then moved on. A knocker-up would also use a snuffer outer as a tool to rouse the sleeping. This implement was used to put out gas lamps which were lit at dusk and then needed to be extinguished at dawn. There were large numbers of people carrying out the job, especially in larger industrial towns such as Manchester. Generally the job was done by elderly men and pregnant women, but sometimes police constables supplemented their pay by performing the task during early morning patrols. Molly Moore, daughter of Mary Smith, also a knocker-up and the protagonist of a children's picture book by Andrea Uren called Mary Smith, claims to have been the last knocker-up to have been employed as such. Both Smith and Moore used a long rubber tube to shoot dried peas at the client's windows. In Ferryhill, County Durham, miners' houses had slate boards set into their outside walls onto which the miners would write their shift details in chalk so that the colliery employed knocker-up could wake them at the correct time. These boards were known as knocky-up boards, or wake-up slates. This practice continued through the age of industrialization into the 1960s, and waned as more people could afford their own watches and clocks with alarms. According to the BBC, knocker-uppers were common in mill towns in northern Britain, or in London where dockers had unusual hours, and even with brewery workers in less industrial towns in Dorset. In return for being awakened, customers paid the knocker-up a set weekly fee. These weekly fees were reasonable and usually based on how far the knocker-up had to travel and the time of day the person needed to be awakened. Mrs. Waters charged the following. All who were knocked up before 4 o'clock paid 18p a week. Those who had to be awakened after 4 gave a shilling a week. Whilst those who had to be aroused from 5 to 6 o'clock paid from 6p to 3p weekly. According to Time and Distance, Mrs. Waters claimed she never earned less than 30 shillings a week, mostly 35, and as high as 40 shillings a week. However, most of Mrs. Waters' clients were knocked up between 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning.